The quiet history of drinking water. Today, drinking water is simple. Most people turn on a tap, fill a glass, and take a sip without thinking about it very much. Clean water appears instantly, and the entire process takes only a few seconds. But for most of human history, drinking water required more time, more effort, and more patience. It was a small task repeated many times every day, and like many everyday routines, it rarely appeared in history books. Finding water. Long ago, people lived close to natural water sources. Villages often formed near rivers, lakes, or springs. These places provided water not only for drinking, but also for cooking, washing, and farming. A river might flow quietly past a village. A spring might bubble gently from the ground. People learned where water could be found and returned to those places again and again. For many families, the first task of the morning involved visiting the water source, the walk to the water. In many communities, someone had to walk to collect water. They carried containers made from clay, wood, metal, or leather. Sometimes these containers were small. Sometimes they were quite heavy. The walk to the water might take only a few minutes. In other places, it might take much longer. People walked slowly along familiar paths. The same paths were used every day. Footsteps gradually formed narrow trails leading toward wells or rivers. Over time, these trails became part of the landscape, filling the container. Once someone reached the water source, the next step was filling the container. If the water came from a river or lake, the container was dipped carefully into the water. If the water came from a well, a bucket was lowered using a rope. The bucket splashed into the water below. Then it was pulled upward again. Sometimes this required strength and patience. The bucket moved slowly, dripping water as it rose. Finally, the container was filled. The walk home. After collecting water, the person returned home. This part of the journey required balance. Water containers could be heavy. If the path was uneven, water might spill, so people often walked slowly and carefully. In many places, people carried containers on their heads. This method allowed them to balance the weight more easily. Other people carried buckets using their hands or shoulders. However it was carried, the journey was repeated many times each day. Drinking water. Once the water arrived at home, it was used carefully. Some water was used for cooking, some was used for cleaning, and some was saved for drinking. People drank water throughout the day, especially during hot weather or after working in fields. Sometimes the water tasted fresh and cool, other times it tasted slightly different depending on the source. But water was always essential. Without it, daily life could not continue. Water and community. Water sources also became places where people met each other. Neighbors often arrived at the same time to collect water. They talked while waiting for their turn. They shared news about weather, harvest, or family events. These small conversations became part of daily life. In this way, water sources were not only practical places, they were also social places. The arrival of pipes. Over time, technology slowly changed how people accessed water. Cities began building pipes and pumps. Water could travel through underground systems directly to homes. This change saved people many hours of walking and carrying, but it also removed one of the quiet daily routines that had existed for centuries. The familiar walk to the well slowly disappeared. A simple moment. Today, drinking water is quick and easy. A glass is filled, a sip is taken, and the moment passes. But in the past, that simple sip represented a much longer journey. A walk to the river, a bucket lowered into a well, a careful trip back home. All for a small but essential part of daily life. A quiet ending. History often focuses on great events, wars, discoveries, and powerful leaders. Yet everyday life was filled with small routines: collecting water, carrying it home, and finally drinking it. These simple actions happened millions of times across villages and cities throughout history. Most of them were never recorded, but together they formed the quiet rhythm of everyday human life. And sometimes that quiet rhythm tells its own kind of story.
The extremely boring history of sitting in the shade. On a warm day, sitting in the shade can feel very comfortable. A tree blocks the sun, the air feels cooler, and the world seems a little quieter. Today, people might sit under umbrellas, inside buildings, or in air-conditioned rooms. But for most of human history, shade was one of the simplest ways to escape the heat. And people used it often. The sun in daily work. For farmers, builders, travelers, and shepherds, the sun was always present during the day. In cooler seasons, sunlight was welcome. But in hot seasons, especially in dry or tropical regions, the sun could become intense. Working under the sun for many hours made people tired. Sweat covered their skin. The ground became warm. Tools felt hot in their hands. Because of this, people often searched for moments of shade. Trees as natural shelters. Long before modern buildings, trees provided natural protection from sunlight. Large trees with wide branches created cool areas beneath them. These shaded spaces became small resting places. A farmer working in fields might pause for a moment. He walked to a nearby tree and sat on the ground. The leaves above blocked the sunlight. The air beneath felt cooler. For a few minutes, work stopped. Nothing dramatic happened. The farmer simply rested quietly. Travelers on long roads, travelers also depended on shade. Walking long distances under the sun could be exhausting. Roads often passed through open landscapes where shade was rare. When a tree appeared along the road, travelers noticed it immediately. Many of them stopped there. Some drank water, some stretched their legs, some simply sat quietly and looked around. After resting, they stood up again and continued walking. Market shade. Markets in many towns were busy and noisy places. But even in these lively areas, shade was important. Merchants sometimes placed cloth coverings above their stalls. This created small shaded spaces where customers could stand comfortably. People buying vegetables or bread often paused beneath these coverings. The shade made the market easier to visit during hot days, village gatherings. Shade also became a natural meeting place in villages. A large tree at the center of a village often attracted people during the afternoon. Elders sat together and talked. Children played nearby. Neighbors shared stories or discussed daily events. These quiet gatherings did not always involve important decisions. Often people simply sat together because the shade was pleasant. Animals and shade. Humans were not the only ones seeking shade. Animals also rested beneath trees during hot weather. Cows, goats, and sheep gathered where the ground felt cooler. Shepherds watched them from nearby. Sometimes both animals and people shared the same shaded space. The entire scene remained calm and still, waiting for the sun to move. Shade did not stay in one place all day. As the sun moved across the sky, shadow slowly shifted. A shady spot in the morning might disappear by afternoon. So people adjusted. They moved their seats. They followed the shadow of the tree, or they simply waited until the sun lowered later in the day. A simple kind of comfort. Sitting in the shade was never a dramatic event. It was a small moment between tasks, a pause during travel, a short rest during work. Yet these small moments happened countless times across history. Farmers, travelers, merchants, and villagers all shared this simple habit, a quiet ending. Today, shade can come from buildings, umbrellas, or indoor spaces, but the simple shade of a tree still offers the same quiet comfort it always has. A cool patch of ground, soft light filtered through leaves, and a brief moment to sit, breathe, and rest. For thousands of years, people have paused beneath trees for this simple reason. Not because something important happened, but because the shade was there. And sometimes that was reason enough to stop for a while. Juan.
The quiet history of waiting for bread to bake. For most people today, baking bread takes only a short time. Or it's purchased already baked at a store, but for thousands of years, bread making was a slow, careful, and often quiet process. People could spend hours simply waiting while their bread baked, and yet, that waiting was an essential part of daily life, preparing the dough. The process began with grinding grain into flour before machines. This meant using stones or hand mills. Once the flour was ready, water and sometimes salt were added to make dough. Kneading the dough required time and effort. It was slow, repetitive work. The dough had to be soft and elastic, ready to rise. Even small mistakes could ruin the bread, letting the dough rise. After kneading, the dough was left to rise. This stage required patience. Yeast, whether natural or cultivated, works slowly. Sometimes it took hours for the dough to become soft and fluffy enough for baking. People often watched it carefully, occasionally poking or pressing to check progress baking the bread. Once the dough was ready, it was placed in an oven. Ovens were not always modern. Many were stone or clay. The bread baked slowly over a steady fire. Heat had to be monitored carefully. Too hot, and the bread burned; too cool, and it stayed doughy inside. Most families could not rush this process. They waited, minute by minute, hour by hour. The quiet watch. While the bread baked, families often used the time for other small tasks. Some repaired tools or clothing. Others swept floors or prepared other meals. Many simply sat quietly nearby, listening to the crackling of the fire. The aroma of baking bread filled the home. Even though the activity was simple, it created a calm, comforting environment. Bread as a daily rhythm. Bread was not a special occasion food. For many communities, it was eaten daily, multiple times a day. The act of waiting for bread became part of the rhythm of life. Morning bread, midday bread, evening bread. Each loaf required patience. Each loaf required quiet attention. Social moments. Sometimes neighbors gathered while bread baked. They talked softly, exchanged small news, or simply shared the warmth of the oven fire. Baking bread could be a communal, peaceful activity, though still slow and repetitive. A simple ending. Today, we often forget how much time went into small tasks in history. Waiting for bread to bake was slow, it was ordinary, but it was also essential. Families waited, loaves slowly browned in the oven. The smell filled homes. Then, finally, the bread was ready. A quiet, unremarkable, yet comforting moment. And that was how everyday history unfolded, one loaf at a time.